The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, is now recognized for his questions.
I thank the chairman. I thank the witnesses for appearing before the committee. I thank the gentleman for bringing this legislation before us. I, too, share your desire to eliminate the ability of not just cartels, but all of those that are moving fentanyl and using the ability to kind of obfuscate and then have the precursors and the things that create fentanyl make it much more complex for our law enforcement and, frankly, result in fentanyl that is far more deadly and is, I think, a key reason for why we've had so many deaths across the country. So I think what you're trying to do here is the right thing to do. And I understand some of the questions that are raised. I just think the bill's pretty simple and pretty straightforward. But I wanted to give the gentleman the ability to expand on that point about you were just alluding to in your questioning the simplicity of the legislation. And just for the record, repeat why precisely you think it's important that we have on Schedule 1 these core components of fentanyl that are currently able to be used to game the system by cartels and illegal actors in the United States.
Yeah, well, what brought the original temporary scheduling into place was the fact that the cartels were trying to argue in court that because the molecule didn't line up exactly with the definition of fentanyl that's used medicinally, even though it would have the same impacts and is a fentanyl-related substance or fentanyl analog, that they therefore were not guilty of as charged. This eliminates that argument, and as we saw from the data, 90% of the people trying to do that was eliminated once we scheduled it temporarily. We need to make that permanent. So they saw a drop in the people who were trying to play games with the formula as soon as we scheduled it as a Schedule 1 temporarily. So we already saw the benefit, but if we let it expire in March, we lose that benefit, and they'll go back to playing that game, looking then for a judge who will say, that's not real fentanyl, case dismissed, and then we have somebody who should have gone through the justice system escaping punishment for having done illegal activity. And this just makes it simple that you don't have to have the exact same molecule, but it has to be a fentanyl-related substance or fentanyl analog.
Now, fentanyl itself is a Schedule 2 drug because of its medicinal uses, correct? And so the point here is that we're not moving fentanyl itself to Schedule 1,
that is
but
correct.
We're just saying how these precursors or these components can be used illicitly. That's the goal here of why putting it to Schedule 1. I think with respect to research, it is my understanding that Schedule 1 drugs are allowed to have federally approved research, right? So that research is able to proceed, and it's up to administrations to expedite that and move it along as necessary. Is that correct?
That is correct, but this bill does make that process a little bit easier for people who are trying to do medical research on the fentanyl analogs or fentanyl-related substances.
Well, and
I use those terms interchangeably. It's
Sure.
actually defined, I think, as fentanyl-related substances.
I appreciate that. I mean, and I would just note that this matters a great deal. Obviously, I was listening to Derek Maltz, the new DEA administrator, that about why important this is. He's a good friend. I've recounted numerous times in this committee and in the Judiciary Committee the number of people who have died from fentanyl. Of course, all of us are touched by it in every district across the country. I know you are in Southwest Virginia. I certainly am. I mean, in Hayes County, Texas, southwest of Austin, we had 6 kids die from fentanyl poisonings in the last school year in the school district in which I live, where my family and I live in Hayes County. We had many others who had to be resuscitated with Narcan and other situations, and I think we had something like almost 3,000 who died across the state of Texas, fairly significant numbers. So obviously it's really critically important that we move on this, and obviously we're in rapid engagement in trying to push back on the cartels, and they're responding. We're seeing that, and we saw some activity yesterday that some Border Patrol agents sent me, video of cartels literally using drones and bombing themselves with explosives. There was reports today of cartels' engagement with the Border Patrol agents and firing on them. Obviously, we've had the president's engagement with the state of Mexico in terms of what's happening with putting more forces on the northern border. Whatever conversations occurred or didn't occur with the previous administration, we're seeing action now that is dramatically reducing the number of people flowing across the border. That's just factually obvious and true. And so now we're down to something like, I think I saw 400 and something apprehensions a day was reported by Bill Malugin just yesterday. which are historic lows and trending in the right direction. I hope we can get that close to zero, so that, as you said, we can get Border Patrol focusing on, ports of entry and, making sure that's operating, and then between the ports of entry, stopping the flow of illicit traffic. I would ask the gentleman on the thing about the mandatory minimums, and whether we agree or disagree on mandatory minimums generally. I hear your sensitivity, and me too, about having any kind of like blanket, minimums that pull judgment out of it. Although my experience as a prosecutor on the other side of the table was that you still had flexibility even within the mandatory minimum framework, but in terms of how we applied. But at the end of the day, with the mandatory minimums, wasn't that a response to judges who were effectively walking away from their duty to ensure that criminals weren't put in jail?
That is correct.
I mean, isn't that why they existed?
That is correct, and oftentimes I did find it in my criminal defense work that judges would try to figure out ways to ameliorate the mandatory minimum, not to get rid of it, but to ameliorate it. Maybe there was an additional charge that they could put no time on, that kind of thing, if they thought the circumstances made it necessary. But you're absolutely right. The reason mandatory minimums came into existence were judges who were not following the basic tenets of what the legislative body in the various states or in the U.S. had set out.
And your bill doesn't address mandatory minimums. Your bill just creates a framework with respect to the
That is correct.
the components of fentanyl.
That is correct.
And then that would then relate to mandatory minimums under existing law, correct?
That is correct.
So we're not addressing that, right?
That is correct.
The last point that I would just make, there was some commentary on some colleagues on the other side about the, supposedly controversial memorandum issued by the Office of Management and Budget, which was guidance that, has been rescinded. But in light of what was put forward, let's just be very clear, it was a temporary pause. And it was, to the extent that it was permitted by law, it was grant, federal financial assistance programs that are implicated by the president's executive orders regarding DEI, climate change, and a lot of the woke agenda, a lot of the things the president put forward. It was designed to ensure that a lot of those programs weren't proceeding. And those programs, for example, we're talking about including dollars that were flowing to through NGOs and through organizations that find those dollars that get to Mexico, that get to the cartels, that get to the flow of human beings and narcotics, fentanyl, through our southern border, that there was dollars flowing from taxpayers through NGOs that was facilitating the very trafficking that we're trying to address in this bill. So I think OMB should be commended for trying to clarify that. The White House should be commended for trying to restrict the flow of American taxpayer dollars through NGOs to those who wish to do us harm, because that is factually occurring and factually accurate. And so I think the president is correct to be doing that, and correct to be aggressive in doing that, and similarly correct in being aggressive at going after USAID funding, which was just blatantly filled with absurd spending. $1.5 million to advance diversity, equity, inclusion in Serbia's workplace and business communities. $70,000 for production of a DEI musical in Ireland. $2.5 million for electric vehicles for Vietnam. $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia. $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. $2 million for sex changes and LGBT activism in Guatemala. $6 million for tourism in Egypt. Millions to EcoHealth Alliance, $20 million for Sesame Street in Iraq to promote inclusion, $45 million for DEI scholarships in Burma. I could go on and on and on. It is absurd use of taxpayer dollars. I applaud the president, the White House for going after them, and I appreciate you bringing this legislation before the Rules Committee. I'll support the rule, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, and I would first yield to Mr. McGovern for a minute.
Yeah, I would just say to the gentleman who just